I had attended perhaps 100 evenings at Crestmore Hall over the course of my life, and I can tell you with absolute honesty that until that particular Thursday in November, not one of them had left me changed. They were beautiful evenings, if you are partial to the kind of beauty that has been carefully arranged to remind you of someone else's wealth. The hall itself was magnificent. A Georgian pile set back from the lane behind 2 rows of lime trees that had been trained into perfect symmetry over the better part of a century, so that arriving guests passed between them feeling, I always suspected, like offerings being carried to an altar. The music room occupied the west wing, a long rectangular space of pale plasterwork and dark wainscoting, a chandelier of such proportions that it made the guests beneath it look like children peering up at a January moon. At the far end, on a shallow stage barely raised from the floor, stood a Bosendorfer concert grand of 1920s vintage, ivory keys yellowed only at the very edges, its lacquer the color of still water at midnight. I am Edwin Marsh. I was, until my 67th year, the editor of a regional newspaper that had reported on births and deaths and planning disputes and occasional municipal scandal for the better part of a century and a half. I mention this only because my qualifications for telling you this story are not musical. I cannot read a score. I cannot name the difference between a nocturne and a prelude by ear alone, though I know the difference when I hear it, in the way a man who cannot name every component of a fine clock still knows when one is keeping perfect time. What I can do, what 40 years of editing had made second nature to me, is read a room, read the faces in it, read the silences that open between words, and what those silences are trying not to say. What I read at Crestmore Hall that November, before Eleanor Vane ever touched a key, was a room in which every person present had made a private accommodation with cruelty. We had all, in our different ways, decided not to see what was plainly in front of us. That is the only honest way I know to begin. I had known Eleanor's father, Geoffrey Vane, for 30 years before his death. We had been at school together, briefly, and had maintained one of those friendships that deepens not through frequency, but through the quality of the occasions that periodically bring 2 people back into a room together. Geoffrey was an uncommonly decent man, a solicitor by profession, a devoted father by nature, a man who spoke warmly of other people as a habitual matter of character rather than policy. His one daughter had been, I gathered over the years, the great preoccupation of his quiet heart. He had given her piano lessons from the age of 4, a serious teacher, he told me once, a woman who had trained at the conservatoire in Brussels and had settled in the county town after her marriage. Eleanor had taken to it, he said, with a concentrated seriousness that surprised even the teacher. By the time she was 12, she was working through pieces the teacher admitted were at the limit of her own ability to instruct. By 17, she was moving through the Beethoven sonatas with a rigor Geoffrey described to me with a mixture of pride and helplessness, as though a river had started running through his house and there was nothing to do but admire it. She had, as Geoffrey put it once, sitting across from me in my study late on a winter evening, a glass of port in his hand, his face carrying the particular expression of a man who has arrived at something he does not fully know how to say. She had a gift that he did not entirely understand. Not the technical gift, he understood that well enough. Something underneath the technique, something that happened when she played that he could not account for by lessons or practice hours or the quality of the instrument. He tried several times to articulate it, and each time abandoned the attempt and looked at his glass. I remember him saying, finally, when she plays, Edwin, there are people who cry and have no idea why they're crying. People who do not, in ordinary life, cry at anything. He paused. I cry, he said. Every time I have cried for 15 years. He looked at me steadily, and I understood this to be not a confession of weakness, but a precise and careful statement of fact. I had not known what to do with it then. I filed it away in the manner I filed away everything I was not yet sure how to use, and I poured us both another glass, and we talked of other things, and the evening passed, as evenings do, and the thing Geoffrey had said receded into the general store of things I knew without quite attending to. I have thought often about what might have happened if I had attended to it. Eleanor had married Lord Crestmore, Marcus Vane, who had taken the title on his father's death 3 years before, in the summer of her 29th year, a marriage that had surprised most of the county, and, I had always privately suspected, surprised Geoffrey Vane more than anyone, though he said nothing about it to me, then or afterward. I had met Marcus Crestmore on perhaps 6 occasions before the marriage. He was a handsome man, tall, with the kind of absolute physical ease that old money produces in certain people, a relaxation of the body so complete it sometimes reads, at a distance, as warmth, until you are close enough to see that the eyes do not participate in whatever the mouth is doing. He spoke fluently and pleasantly on almost any subject. He moved through rooms as though the rooms had been built with him specifically in mind. He treated other people, I observed, in the manner of a man who is privately aware that he is being very gracious. I did not like him. I had not said so to Geoffrey, because Geoffrey had not asked, and because Eleanor had chosen him, and there was nothing useful to be added to a done thing. But I had carried that private assessment quietly for the 11 years of their marriage, in the way you carry a small stone in your shoe that you have decided, for reasons of social convenience, not to stop and remove. I arrived at Crestmore Hall that November evening, at 7:15, having been collected by car. The musicale was the Duke's annual occasion. He held one each November, invited between 50 and 80 guests from the county's social upper reaches, and engaged a performer of some recognized standing to serve as the evening's centerpiece. This year, it was a concert pianist known well enough to need no extensive introduction here. He had recorded Chopin and Schumann for a label of distinction, had performed at halls in London and Vienna and Berlin, was perhaps 55 years of age, and wore his eminence with the compact certainty of a man who has spent long enough in rooms where other people rise when he enters. I shall call him simply the maestro, because that is what the Duke called him when he introduced him, loudly, across the assembled guests, at 7:30, as though presenting a prize acquisition. Eleanor stood to the maestro's left during this introduction. She was dressed in a gray-blue evening gown of no particular drama, her hair arranged simply, her expression the mild, attentive expression she habitually wore at these evenings, the expression of a woman who has learned to be present without quite arriving. She was 40 years old, still slender in the way that she had always been slender, with the quality of stillness about her that I had noticed even in her childhood years when Geoffrey had brought her to visit, not the stillness of emptiness, but of a controlled interior, a still surface over a running current. I had always thought that about her. I thought it again as I watched her listen to her husband present the maestro to the room. Marcus Crestmore was at his most charming that evening. He had the gift, I have to grant it, of making a room feel curated by his personal attention. He circulated, he named people, he remembered details with the practiced accuracy of a man who has spent decades understanding that power accrues to those who make other people feel specifically seen. He laughed often. His laugh was a good laugh, or sounded like one. He poured wine himself at 2 or 3 moments in the early part of the evening, a theatrical gesture of informality that the guests invariably received as evidence of genuine warmth. I was standing near the fireplace with a glass of something excellent, watching the room, as I always did, when Marcus appeared at my shoulder. "Edwin," he said, "good of you to come. I know Eleanor is always glad to have you." "And I her," I said. He glanced across the room to where she was speaking with 2 women of her own approximate age. "She seems well," I said. "Doesn't she?" he said, pleasantly, with the intonation of a man confirming a minor item of household inventory, and moved on. I watched him go, the stone in my shoe pressed slightly harder. I turned back to the room, as I said, because it was my habit. There were perhaps 50 guests already gathered, with more arriving in small clusters at intervals. I knew many of them. The county has its circuits, and I had spent 40 years attending events on all of them. There was a retired circuit judge I had known since his early practice days, his wife beside him in the amber glow of the fireplace light, both of them holding their champagne with the particular ease of people who have attended so many evenings exactly like this one that the gestures have become automatic. There was a woman who had been the chair of the hospital board for 15 years, speaking with the animation that public office gives people when they are briefly free of it. There were younger couples, the inheritors, in various senses, of the county's social position, navigating the room with the slightly heightened awareness of people who understand that these evenings are also, among other things, performances. And there was Eleanor, moving among them in the gray-blue gown, unhurried, pleasant, entirely present in the social sense and entirely somewhere else in some other sense that I had never been able to name. People spoke to her and she answered, and she smiled and she asked follow-up questions, and she laughed at the right moments, and yet I always had the impression of watching a person engaged in something very slightly beside the point of where their real attention resided, not rudely so, not in any way that anyone could have named as absence, only in the way that a river, diverted into channels for the purposes of irrigation, is still always running toward the sea. I watched her cross the room to speak with an elderly woman in blue, one of the senior county families, a woman who had known Geoffrey Vane well, and who put her hand on Eleanor's arm with the proprietary warmth of long acquaintance. Eleanor received this with the warmth it deserved. She inclined her head, she covered the woman's hand briefly with her own, and then her eyes, just for a moment, one small, unguarded moment, moved to the far end of the room, to the Bosendorfer on its shallow stage, and back. It lasted perhaps a second. The woman in blue was already speaking again. Eleanor returned her full attention to her. I set down my glass, which had been empty for some time, and collected a fresh one from a passing tray. The musicale proper began at 8 o'clock. Chairs had been arranged in 3 rows facing the Bosendorfer, and a further scattering of armchairs and settees at the edges of the room for those who preferred informality. The maestro sat in a chair to the right of the instrument, speaking with 2 guests who had positioned themselves near him with the careful strategy of people who know that proximity to eminence is a transmissible quality. Eleanor took a chair in the 2nd row. I settled in an armchair at the left edge, where I had a view of the keyboard from the side and the full room in front of me. Old editorial instinct, always the view from which you can see everything. Marcus stood near the instrument. He waited for the room's conversations to die, which they did, in the practiced way of guests who know their host's signals. "Well," he said, "before our guest treats us to what I suspect will be rather an exceptional evening, I wonder whether we might warm the instrument." He smiled, the controlled, delighting in himself smile. "Eleanor," he turned to his wife, "you enjoy your little sessions at the piano, don't you? Perhaps you'd play something for our guests, something simple, to start us off." I have recalled that sentence many times in the years since. The precision of it still arrests me. Every word chosen with the care of a man who has learned to be cruel without appearing to be, something simple, as though she were a child offering to demonstrate a nursery song. To start us off, as though she were a preliminary act, and the inflection of "you enjoy your little sessions," that diminutive, that indulgence, the framing of her practice as a pastime, a hobby, the sweet and endearing way she kept herself occupied. And then the particular quality of the room's response, the mild, polite, entirely unremarkable response, as though nothing in what he had said required any adjustment. Several guests glanced toward Eleanor. 2 or 3 smiled encouragingly, the encouraging smile you offer a person who is being asked to do something slightly out of their depth. The maestro lifted his glass and looked at the Bosendorfer with the mild, private amusement of a man at a gallery who was about to watch a child attempt a copy of a master. Eleanor looked at her husband for a moment. I watched her face. It was quite still. There was nothing in it that I could name with certainty. No hurt, no anger, no performance of either stoicism or embarrassment. Only that stillness I had noticed for 30 years, the controlled interior, the running current beneath. Then she rose from her chair and walked to the piano. The room rearranged itself slightly, attentively, in the pleasant way of people who have been offered mild entertainment and are prepared to receive it graciously. The maestro settled back in his chair. Marcus placed himself to one side, arms loosely folded, wearing the expression of a man presiding generously over something he expects to find charming. Eleanor arrived at the bench. She reached down and turned the height adjustment without looking at it, One deliberate, unhurried movement. Exactly right. The movement of someone who has made this precise adjustment so many times that the hands know it the way the hand knows the height of a door handle in one's own home. She placed the back of her right hand against the inner face of the lid casing for a moment. Not leaning on it, just touching, in the way of someone greeting an old acquaintance in a very quiet room. She did not look at the keyboard. She sat, settled, placed her hands in her lap for one moment, and was still. I noticed that I am not able to explain, even now, what it was I felt in that moment before she played. I am a man who has had limited use for premonitions, professionally or otherwise. But there was something in the room in that pause, some alteration in the quality of the air itself, some indefinable shift, that had nothing to do with anticipation for a pleasant amateur performance. The hairs along my arms, which I had not been aware of at all until that moment, came faintly upright. I looked at Eleanor's back, at the line of her spine, at the absolute quality of the stillness in her, and I thought of Geoffrey Vane on a winter evening, a glass in his hand, abandoning the attempt to say the thing he meant, saying instead, "I cry," every time. Her hands lifted from her lap and settled on the keys. The first chord of Beethoven's Tempest Sonata came out of the Bosendorfer like a stone dropped into deep water, not loud precisely, but of a weight and a depth that displaced everything around it. It was the opening of the first movement, that single sustained chord beneath the arpeggiated right hand, and she played it with a gravity that had nothing to do with force and everything to do with intention. Then the agitato passage came, the left hand driving, the right hand searching, restless, urgent, and the room, which had been exhaling quietly in the expectation of a pleasant diversion, forgot to exhale at all. Conversation did not stop all at once. It stopped the way a fire stops when water is poured over it. Section by section, cluster by cluster, each small fire of talk extinguished as the notes reached it. The two women on the settee to the right, who had been speaking in low voices, stopped mid-sentence. A man standing near the drinks table set his glass down without looking at it. A younger woman near the back row sat slightly forward in her chair. An elderly man I had known as a genial conversationalist for 20 years went very still in the face, and his stillness had in it something I recognized, not as boredom, but as the particular arrested quality of someone who has heard something they cannot immediately categorize and is holding themselves quiet to keep receiving it. The maestro's face was the first I looked at carefully, because it was the measure I trusted most. He had been holding his wine glass at the level of his chest, and in the first 20 seconds of Eleanor's playing, his grip on the stem changed, became, somehow, more deliberate, and then his hand lowered slowly to his knee, and the glass rested there, and he sat very still. His head tilted by perhaps 3 or 4 degrees toward the piano. His expression, which had carried that mild private amusement, did not shift into something I could easily name. It shifted into something I recognized more than I could categorize: attention. The quality of attention of a person encountering something that requires it. The unmistakable expression of a professional who has heard, in the first 8 bars, everything they need to know about the scale of what is in front of them. She played through the first movement with a control that I could feel even without understanding its technical dimensions. The phrases shaped, the dynamics graduated, the restlessness of the music made to feel inevitable rather than arbitrary, as though the turbulence the piece contained were a thing being managed by hands that had lived inside it for long enough to know its every current and eddy. There was nothing tentative in it, no pauses to locate the next passage, no small hesitations that betray a player working from memory with uncertain confidence. She played as though the piece were playing itself through her, and her only obligation was to get out of its way. The second movement, the adagio, a long searching thing, a piece of music that moves toward no simple resolution, that refuses the comfort of arriving cleanly anywhere, descended into the room like weather, not loud, the opposite of loud, and yet filling the space entirely, the way a certain quality of silence fills a room, the way absence can be a presence more substantial than anything it replaces. It moved slowly, and it moved surely, and it took its time in the way that only the completely unafraid can take their time, without apology for its duration, without self-consciousness, certain of its own necessity. I am not a man who has language for what music does inside a person. I have always distrusted the descriptions, soaring, haunting, heartbreaking, because they seem to be describing the feeling from a distance, as though the writer were reporting on something observed through glass, rather than experienced from inside it. What I can tell you is what the adagio did to the room. Not to me specifically, though it did things to me specifically that I am not entirely comfortable with. At 71 years old, in a room full of people I have known for decades. What it did to the room. It removed us from the evening. That is as close as I can get. It did not add something, a feeling of beauty, an emotional color, so much as it subtracted the surface of things. The social texture of the room, the careful management of impression that all of us were perpetually engaged in without being aware of it, the gathering of status and the spending of charm, the slight performance of every gesture in a room where being seen to be the right sort of person has commercial and social value. All of this was simply not present during the adagio. What was present was 60 people sitting with their actual faces on, without armor, listening to something that had apparently decided to mean something to each of them personally, without asking whether that was convenient. The retired circuit judge had his eyes closed. I noticed this because I would not have expected it of him. He is a man who has trained himself to watch, and I have seen him at 100 events and never seen his eyes closed in public. They were closed now. Whatever the adagio had found in him, he had decided, apparently, not to resist it. I looked at Marcus Crestmore. He had remained in his position at the edge of the performing area, arms still loosely folded, with the presumable intention of looking like a host who had offered the room a small and pleasant courtesy. He no longer looked like that. He was standing very still in the particular way that a person stands still who does not know they have become still, unconsciously, compelled. His face, and I watched it with the care I had given 30 years of watching faces for the things they were trying not to reveal. His face had done something I had not seen it do in all the years I had observed him. The performance had left it, not the surface of it. The features remained as they were, but the management of the surface, the deliberate quality. Whatever he was feeling, he was no longer fully managing the display of it. His jaw was set, his eyes were fixed on his wife's back, fixed in a way that had the quality of a calculation that was not resolving. I have thought since about what he might have been calculating, whether he had known, whether he had always known, in some private, suppressed way, and had spent 11 years arranging not to acknowledge it, presenting her publicly as a pleasant dabbler, precisely because the alternative, the reality of her, was a magnitude he did not know what to do with. I cannot know. I only know what his face did, and what it did, as her fingers moved through the second movement of a sonata she must have played 1,000 times in 30 years of private, unwitnessed practice, was show something I had not seen there in 11 years, a man recognizing that he had made a fundamental error of measurement. She did not rush. That is what I remember most clearly about the second movement. She did not rush toward the resolution. She let it be what it was, whatever it was, in all its duration, and the room let her. 60 people in formal evening dress sat in the kind of silence that is not the silence of waiting, but the silence of receiving. Several of them, I noticed in peripheral glances, were very still in the face, not the stillness of boredom, but the stillness of people engaged in something involuntary, something that had arrived before they had a chance to decide whether to admit it. A woman in the third row had her hand pressed lightly to the base of her throat. A retired general I had known for 20 years was sitting with his forearms on his thighs and his eyes on the floor between his feet, in the posture of a man who is holding himself together at some interior structural level that ordinary evenings do not usually require. The third movement came. The D minor presto, that driven, urgent, relentless thing, all forward motion and necessity, a piece that seems to refuse rest because rest would constitute a kind of dishonesty. And here Eleanor altered entirely. The stillness in her that I had observed through the first two movements, the contained, managed quality, gave way to something I had no word for. Not wildness. The technique did not abandon the control, but a liberation of intention, as though for two movements she had been showing the room what she could do, and in the third she was simply doing it, with a freedom that had no interest in reception. The left hand drove beneath the right with something that I, sitting at the left edge of the room with a view of the keys, can only describe as tremendous, not in volume but in mass, in commitment, in the weight of 30 years of practice behind each phrase. The arpeggios of the right hand sang above it like a voice that has finally been given permission to reach its full range. The Bosendorfer answered with the whole body of the instrument, a sound that came not from the strings alone, but from the case and the pedals and the floor beneath them, a resonance that you felt as much as heard, the note and its overtones filling every corner of that long room simultaneously. Two people were openly weeping by the third minute of the final movement. I noticed this without registering it as unusual, which perhaps tells you something about the quality of what was in the room. The maestro had not moved. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees, his wine glass set on the floor beside his chair, his hands loosely clasped, his eyes on the piano, with an expression that I have since described to others, inadequately, as the expression of a man who has encountered something that has reordered one of his central assumptions. He was not distressed by this. He appeared, if anything, to be undergoing something that looked very much like gratitude, or perhaps like relief. The relief of a man who has spent years in the company of a craft he loves deeply and has not, for some time, been surprised by it. I looked at Marcus again. He had not moved either. He was still standing at the edge of the stage area in what had begun as the posture of a presiding host, and was now the posture of a man who does not know how to leave a position he should not have taken. His arms were no longer loosely folded. His hands were at his sides. The expression management had failed entirely. What was on his face was something I had no wish to catalogue, not because it was dramatic, but because it was private, or would have been private, in any room that was not entirely occupied with what his wife's hands were doing on the keys of his Bosendorfer. Eleanor played the final measures with the full authority of everything that had preceded them, the accumulated weight of the entire piece arriving at its final resolution with something that felt, to my untrained ears, exactly like inevitability, like the conclusion of an argument so rigorously constructed that the last word has been obvious since the first, and then the final chord. And then she did not move. Silence. It lasted, I counted, because old instincts, 5 seconds. 5 seconds in which 60 people, and one famous pianist, and one duke, sat in the aftermath of something that none of us had been expecting, and that had rearranged, in some permanent way, whatever we thought we were doing that evening. Then the maestro stood up. He did not applaud. He rose from his chair and walked to the piano, and he stood before Eleanor, who had lifted her hands from the keys and placed them in her lap, and was sitting quite still in that familiar, controlled manner of hers. And he bowed. Not the compact, professional acknowledgement of a man used to curtain calls. A full, deliberate bow, from the waist, held for a moment, with his eyes on the floor. The bow of one practitioner to another, offered across the whole distance of what the room had just heard. The room came apart. I mean this in the good sense, the sense of a thing that has been holding itself together under a pressure finally releasing. People stood, not the formal, gradual standing of polite applause, the immediate, involuntary rising of people who are responding to something that has bypassed their considered faculties entirely and gone straight to some more fundamental layer. The applause that followed was not of the kind you hear at concerts where the audience knows it is supposed to be impressed. It was the applause of people who were, for a moment, helpless. People in the grip of something they had not agreed to feel, and could not have predicted, and could not now retract. Eleanor sat through the first several seconds of it. Then she rose, slowly, unhurriedly, with that same quality of contained movement that characterized everything she did, and turned to face the room. Her expression, in this moment, was the one I had been watching for all evening. Not triumph, not vindication in any showy, gratified sense. Something quieter than that, and considerably harder to dismiss. The expression of a person who has finally said, in the only language they fully trust, the thing they have been waiting to say, and who is watching without urgency as the room receives it. She turned slightly, not to look at her husband, but in the motion of acknowledging the room broadly, and in doing so, She faced in Marcus Crestmore's direction. He was still standing at the edge of the area. He was not applauding. He was not applauding in the way of a man who has principled reservations. He was simply standing, very still, with both hands at his sides, and his face had the look of a man in the middle of a long, private, irrevocable reckoning that he had not chosen and could not defer. The room was still on its feet around him. The maestro was still at the piano. The applause was still filling the ceiling, and Marcus Crestmore was standing in the center of it all, entirely alone in the way that a person is alone when the room has chosen, collectively and without discussion, to look at someone else. I did not feel, watching him, the satisfaction I might have expected to feel. I had carried my private assessment of Marcus Crestmore for 11 years, and in that moment the assessment was entirely confirmed, and I did not feel satisfied at all. I felt something more like sorrow, and something more like fury, and underneath both of those something complicated that I think might have been shame on behalf of all of us. Everyone in that room who had attended 11 years of these evenings, and smiled, and received the wine, and watched Eleanor move through the rooms like well-maintained furniture, and made our private accommodations, not ask the question that was always available to be asked. The maestro was speaking to Eleanor. I could not hear the words from my position. He had taken both her hands in his, the hands that had just played 30-odd minutes of Beethoven with a mastery that had silenced his professional judgment entirely, and he was speaking to her with a directness and an absence of performance that I had not seen from him all evening. Eleanor listened. She nodded once. Her expression did not change significantly, but I caught, and I believe I was one of perhaps 2 or 3 people in the right position to catch it, the very small alteration around her eyes that indicates, in a face that has learned to manage itself, that something has been received in a place where management cannot reach. I found myself next to Geoffrey Vane's particular chair, the old wing-backed green one he had favored, the one that Eleanor had brought from his house and installed at the left edge of this room some years after his death. I had noticed it before but never remarked on it, because noticing things without remarking on them is an old professional habit. I stood beside it for a moment and placed my hand on the back of it. Geoffrey had said, "When she plays, there are people who cry and have no idea why." I had no idea, strictly speaking, why. The room was still in motion around me, people speaking, the applause having resolved into the warm, slightly chaotic sound of 60 people, all turning to one another to say the same thing. The maestro still with Eleanor. 2 or 3 guests working their way toward her through the gathered crowd. I kept my hand on the back of the green wing-back chair and thought about Geoffrey sitting in it, every Sunday, for 30 years, listening to his daughter play the piano in the house he had given her everything he had to provide, listening to what she was, and understanding it, and sitting with it in the patient, devoted way of a man who knew, with complete certainty, that the world would eventually require what she had to offer. And I thought about myself, about the 11 years I had attended these evenings and eaten Marcus Crestmore's excellent food and drunk his excellent wine and smiled at his excellent performance of graciousness, and carried my private assessment of him like a small stone in my shoe, and done precisely nothing with it. Not because there was nothing to be done, I did not honestly believe that any longer, but because the easier path had presented itself at every junction and I had taken it, as we all take the easier path when we have persuaded ourselves that the harder one is not our responsibility. I had been Geoffrey Vane's closest friend for 30 years. He had told me, in the only way available to him, obliquely, with a glass of port, abandoning 3 attempts before finding the nearest he could get to the words, that his daughter was extraordinary, that she produced in the people who heard her something involuntary and permanent. I had filed that away as the warm assessment of a loving father, which it was, without registering that it was simultaneously a statement of precise and verifiable fact, which it also was. I had attended 100 evenings at Crestmore Hall and never once sat down next to Eleanor Vane and asked her, "Do you still play?" A question, a simple, ordinary question that any attentive person might have asked. And had I asked it, she might have said yes. And had she said yes, I might have said, "Would you play for me sometime?" And had she said yes to that, and I believe, knowing Eleanor, that she would have said yes to that, I would have heard, in private, perhaps years earlier, the thing I had just heard in a room of 60 people. And perhaps Jeffrey Vane, who died without anyone outside his own four walls ever knowing what his daughter could do, might have heard it too. I stood with my hand on the back of his chair and felt the particular weight of what cannot be undone. I crossed the room to where she was standing. The crowd around her had thinned slightly. The maestro had moved back a step, in the manner of a man who recognizes that other people have claims on a person's attention and is willing to yield to them. I took Eleanor's hand. She looked at me, that controlled face, that running current beneath. "Your father," I said, and stopped because that was as far as I could get. She held my hand for a moment. Then she said quietly, "He came to hear me practice every Sunday. For 30 years, he sat in the green chair." I looked across the room at the green wingback chair against the left wall. "He never told me not to play for anyone," she said. "He always told me they'd hear me eventually." She said this without bitterness, without any sharpness at all, in the level, certain tone of a woman stating a fact that has been proven. I looked over her shoulder. Marcus Crestmore was speaking with two male guests at the far end of the room, his posture recovered, his voice presumably smooth and pleasant again. But I noticed, from 40 feet away, that he had not looked in Eleanor's direction since she had risen from the bench. Not once, in all the time the room had been filling with the energy of what she had done. He was speaking with precision and care to the two men in front of him, and his face was pleasant, and he had not looked at his wife. The maestro appeared at Eleanor's other shoulder. He looked at me briefly, then at her. "I wonder," he said, "whether you have considered performing." He said it without the qualification of perhaps, or whether you might like to. A direct question, from a man who does not qualify. Direct questions, because qualification would be a form of condescension. Eleanor considered this for a moment. "I've thought about it," she said. "I'm in a position," the maestro said, "to introduce you to some people. If you were interested." She looked at him steadily. "I'll think about it seriously," she said. He nodded once, the nod of a man who accepts a non-answer as a serious response and intends to follow it up. Then he excused himself and returned to the guests who had been waiting patiently to speak with him. I stayed where I was for a moment. Eleanor had turned slightly to speak to someone else, and I was on the edge of the conversation, holding a glass of wine that had gone slightly warm, looking at the Bosendorfer sitting quiet on its stage now, the lid still open above the keys. I thought about that instrument sitting in this room for 11 years of annual evenings, its potential unresolved, its whole capacity in abeyance, and how we had walked past it every November and spoken about other things. I thought about what it had sounded like when Eleanor's hands found the frequency it was built to produce. I thought about the 5 seconds of silence after the final chord, the way silence of that quality is not an absence but a substance, a thing with weight and temperature, a thing you feel on your skin. I drove home through lanes made narrow and silver by November frost, and I thought about Jeffrey Vane sitting in his green wing-back chair every Sunday for 30 years, listening to his daughter, crying every time, unable, even to his oldest friend, to say precisely what it was he was hearing. He had been trying to tell me this, that there are people in whom music is not a skill, or an accomplishment, or a talent in the ordinary sense, but something more like a weather system, something that exists at a scale and with a constancy that ordinary categories cannot contain, and that it does not matter whether anyone sees it or names it or gives it an occasion. It is there. It has always been there. All it requires is a room, and a piano, and the particular quality of stillness that arrives in the moment before the first note falls. I have attended, in the years since that evening, several occasions at which Eleanor Vane performed publicly, at halls of some standing, before audiences of some size, to responses that made what happened in Marcus Crestmore's music room seem like a rehearsal. She plays with the same authority, the same interior stillness, the same absolute indifference to whether the room is ready for what she is about to give it. The room is always ready. The room is always made ready by her first note. The Bosendorfer at Crestmore Hall, I am told, has its lid down now. The green wing-backed chair is gone. I think about Jeffrey Vane's face on that winter evening in my study, the glass in his hand, the thing he was trying and failing to say. What I think he was trying to tell me was not complicated, in the end. It was the simplest possible observation, stated by a man who had spent 30 years sitting very still in a green chair, listening. He was saying, "Pay attention, the thing you are about to overlook is the thing." When Eleanor Vane played that night, under the chandelier of her husband's hall, to a room of 60 people who had expected something simple, she gave those 60 people something that most of us spend our whole lives hoping to encounter and frequently fail to. Not just the music, though the music alone was enough to change an evening, enough to give a famous pianist cause to bow. Something underneath the music, the particular quality of truth that arrives when a person who has been waiting a very long time finally does the thing they were built to do, in a room that did not know it was waiting to hear it. The Duke stood at the edge of it, alone in a crowd on its feet. I do not know what happened between them afterward, and it is not mine to know. I know what I saw in that room, and what I saw was this: a man who had called a great thing small, standing in the full presence of its magnitude, with no place left to look that was not the proof of his mistake. And I know what I felt, driving home through the November frost, which was gratitude, gratitude of the complicated kind, with a thread of grief running through it. Gratitude that I had been in the room, that I had been given, at 71 years old and without deserving it, the occasion Jeffrey Vane had waited 30 years to give the world. He was right. They heard her eventually, and when they did, nothing in that room was ever quite the same again.